The boy had no idea what would come next. Cold, dark, and unsure, Derek's breath hung visibly in the crisp Detroit air as he walked alone on the deserted street. The weight of the day, school, odd jobs, his mother's struggles, pushed heavily down on his shoulders. With nothing but a tattered jacket barely holding off the chill, Derek didn't expect anything remarkable to happen that evening. He didn't expect to find a millionaire in disguise, let alone change both of their lives forever. Yet, one act of kindness, one decision to help someone who needed it more, would turn Derek's world upside down. "Hey, wait. Youth boy," the voice called from behind, carrying a mix of desperation and hope. Derek's heart pounded as he turned to see an elderly man, shivering in layers too thin for the icy Detroit night. Derek paused, caught between his own need and a stranger's pain. As the boy began to pull his only jacket from his shoulders, he couldn't have known that the old man he helped would come back with a life-altering surprise. "Hey, everyone, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy inspiring stories like this one." This story starts with Derek facing a challenge head-on, a choice between his own comfort and the well-being of a stranger. And what happens next will surprise you, a journey that reveals the true power of kindness and community, and how even the smallest act of compassion can lead to something extraordinary. Let's jump into this heartfelt tale of generosity and hope, where one young boy's selflessness changes not only his life, but the lives of many around him. A story that proves kindness can break down any barrier, and that sometimes what we give comes back to us in ways we never imagined. Derek trudged along, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, trying to keep his fingers warm. His old jacket, worn but beloved, was just enough to keep the bitter wind from cutting through to his bones. School had been especially draining that day, and afterward, he'd cleared someone's yard for a few extra dollars. Every penny mattered, especially with rent around the corner and his mother already on edge. He needed to help in whatever way he could, even if it meant tiring days and sleepless nights. His mother's worried face haunted him. He wanted to take away her stress, if only for a while. As Derek approached a darkened corner of the street, he noticed someone, a frail figure, hunched down, shivering uncontrollably against the brick wall of an abandoned shop. His heart sank when he saw the man's blue-tinged lips and the way his body seemed to convulse from the cold. Derek's steps slowed. He didn't know why he was stopping, why he even cared. His mom always told him to just focus on getting home. The man's eyes met Derek's for just a moment, eyes filled with weariness, eyes that seemed to ask why the world had abandoned him. Derek swallowed hard, glancing at the coins in his pocket. It wasn't much, but maybe it would be enough for something warm. He knelt down, holding the change out to the stranger. "Here, sir." "It's not much, but it might help," Derek said, his voice a bit shaky. He couldn't explain why he felt the urge to help. Something about the man's eyes, the desperation in them, made it impossible for him to walk away. The old man looked at the coins and then at Derek. For a moment, he seemed too surprised to react. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but he stayed silent. He just shook his head slowly, his eyes distant, lost. Derek frowned. "Come on, take it," he insisted, pushing the coins closer. "It's cold out here. Maybe you can get something warm to drink." The old man gave Derek a weak smile, but his hand stayed wrapped around his knees, refusing to reach for the coins. Derek's heart sank deeper. He could feel the man's exhaustion, his sense of hopelessness. The coins wouldn't be enough, not for what this man needed. Derek stayed there for a second longer, feeling a pit forming in his stomach. The man was freezing, and it was clear the coins wouldn't help him in the way he needed. He could hear the distant hum of a car passing by, see his breath in front of his face. He could feel the cold growing deeper in his bones. He had to do something. Standing up, Derek looked down at his old jacket. It wasn't much, but it was warm. His only jacket. He thought of his mother's reaction. She'd be worried sick if he came home without it, but she'd understand, wouldn't she? Derek chewed on his lip, glancing around the street. A couple of people walked by, their eyes darting towards the old man before quickly looking away, as if they didn't want to see. Derek clenched his jaw, brushing his fingers over the zipper of his jacket. He looked back at the man. His lips were still blue, his eyes closed again, as if he was trying to block out the cold. Maybe even the world itself. Damn it, Derek muttered under his breath. He knelt back down, unzipping his jacket. The cold hit him instantly, biting into his chest. He slid the jacket off his shoulders and draped it over the man's back. "Here," Derek said softly. "You need this more than I do. Just take it. All right." The old man opened his eyes, blinking at Derek in disbelief. His lips trembled, but no words came out. Derek could see tears welling up in the man's eyes as he looked at the jacket, his bony hands slowly coming up to touch it, as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. "It's okay," Derek said, his own voice shaky now. "I'll be fine. You just stay warm. All right." The man's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, his hand clutching the jacket tightly. Derek stood up, already shivering from the cold. He hugged his arms around himself, trying to hold on to whatever warmth he had left. The sky was getting darker, and he knew he had to get home before his mom started to worry. He turned and began walking again, faster this time. His teeth chattered, and his feet felt like blocks of ice as he hurried down the street. The cold cut through his thin shirt like a knife, making his skin prickle and tighten. He could still feel the old man's eyes on his back, and he really hoped, that the jacket would make a difference. "Hey," someone shouted behind him. Derek didn't turn around. He didn't want to explain, didn't want anyone to tell him he was stupid for giving away his only jacket. He just kept walking, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. By the time Derek reached his apartment building, his fingers were numb, and he could barely feel his nose. He fumbled with the door handle, finally managing to get it open and stumbling inside. The warmth of the hallway was a small relief, but it wasn't enough to chase away the deep cold that had settled in his bones. He made his way up the stairs, his legs feeling heavy. When he got to the door of his apartment, he knocked softly. A moment later, the door swung open, and his mom stood there, her eyes widening in shock when she saw him. "Derek, where's your jacket?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry. She pulled him inside, her hands on his shoulders, looking him up and down. "What happened?" Derek forced a smile, trying to play it off. I gave it to someone who needed it more, Mom," he said, his voice shaky. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like she didn't know what to say. Finally, she shook her head, her face a mix of worry and something else, something like pride. She grabbed a blanket from the couch and wrapped it around him, pulling him close. "You're going to catch your death out there, boy," she muttered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm fine," Derek said, though his teeth were still chattering. He hugged the blanket tighter around himself, feeling his mom's arms around him. He was cold, sure, but somehow he felt a little warmer inside. The next morning, Derek woke up with a sore throat. His room was cold, the blanket his mom had wrapped around him having slipped off during the night. He shivered as he rolled out of bed, his breath visible in the early morning air. The apartment wasn't warm enough, and without his jacket, the cold seemed even sharper. Derek slipped his feet into his worn sneakers and shuffled out of his room. His mom was in the small kitchen, her back turned to him as she fried something in a pan. The smell of eggs filled the apartment, but even that warmth wasn't enough to make the chill go away. "Morning, Mom," Derek said, his voice hoarse. She turned, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "You sound terrible," she said, reaching over to the counter and picking up a cup of hot tea. She handed it to him. "Here, drink this." "Thanks," Derek said, wrapping his fingers around the warm cup. It felt good, the warmth spreading through his palms. He sipped it slowly, trying to let the heat slide down his throat. His mom turned back to the stove, flipping the eggs in the pan. "I still can't believe you gave away your jacket," she said quietly, her voice a mix of concern and disbelief. "He needed it more," Derek said simply, taking another sip of tea. He didn't want to argue about it, not when his throat was aching and the cold was still deep in his bones. "Here, sir. It's not much," but Derek's voice cracked slightly, not from the cold, but from the unexpected compassion flooding his chest. The old man looked up, his face hollow and worn, but he didn't reach for the coins. Instead, he just shook his head with a weak smile. "Please take it," Derek insisted, his breath coming out in misty puffs. The old man's smile remained, but his hands stayed wrapped around his knees. He didn't move. Derek stood there, looking at the coins in his hand, and then back at his own worn-out jacket. It wasn't much, but it was all he had, and the man clearly needed it more. Maybe he wouldn't have made that decision if he wasn't so tired, if he didn't feel the old man's suffering like it was his own. But something clicked inside of him. He started unzipping his jacket, feeling the cold pierce through his thin shirt immediately. "Sir, you need this more than I do." Derek's voice was shaky as he pulled the jacket off and gently draped it over the man's back. The man's eyes filled with tears, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. Derek smiled a sad smile and nodded. "Just stay warm, okay? I'll be fine." Derek's arms were already trembling, the cold cutting into his exposed skin. He turned quickly, hugging himself as he walked away, hoping to get back home before the temperature dropped even lower. He didn't look back, afraid that if he did, he might change his mind. The wind picked up as Derek walked, biting at his exposed skin and turning his cheeks a raw, painful red. He clenched his jaw, trying to keep his teeth from chattering, his breath coming out in short, misty bursts. His shirt was too thin to block out the cold, and the chill seemed to seep into his bones. Each step felt heavier than the last, the icy air wrapping around him like a vice. He tried to focus on getting home, on the warmth that waited for him there. His mother would be worried, but she'd understand. She always did. She'd scold him, maybe even yell, but Derek knew that underneath it all, she'd be proud. Proud that he'd done something good, something selfless. At least, that's what he hoped. As he approached his building, Derek could barely feel his fingers. He struggled to get the door open, his hands stiff and uncooperative. The warmth of the hallway hit him like a wave, and he stumbled inside, his body trembling from the sudden change in temperature. He made his way up the stairs, his legs feeling like they could give out at any moment. When he reached his apartment, he knocked softly, the sound barely audible. A moment later, the door opened, and his mother stood there, her eyes widening in shock. "Derek, where's your jacket?" she demanded, her voice a mix of worry and anger. She pulled him inside, her hands immediately rubbing his arms, trying to bring warmth back to his frozen limbs. I gave it to someone who needed it more," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to smile, but his lips were too numb. His mother stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the right words. Finally, she shook her head, her eyes softening. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, pulling him close. "You're going to catch your death out there, you know that," she muttered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm fine," Derek said, though his teeth were still chattering. He hugged the blanket tighter, leaning into his mother's warmth. He could feel her heart pounding against his cheek, and for a moment, he allowed himself to relax. He was home. He was safe. The next morning, Derek woke up with a sore throat and a pounding headache. The blanket his mother had wrapped around him had slipped off during the night, leaving him exposed to the cold that still lingered in the apartment. He groaned, rolling over and pulling the blanket back around himself, trying to find some warmth. "Derek, get up. You'll be late for school," his mother called from the kitchen. The smell of eggs frying filled the small apartment, and Derek's stomach growled in response. "I don't feel good," Derek mumbled, his voice hoarse. His mother appeared in the doorway, her brow furrowing as she looked at him. "You sound terrible," she said, walking over and placing a hand on his forehead. She frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You're burning up. Maybe you should stay home today." Derek shook his head, struggling to sit up. "I can't. I've got a math test today. I can't miss it." His mother sighed, her eyes filled with concern. "You're as stubborn as your father was," she muttered, turning and walking back to the kitchen. She returned a moment later with a cup of hot tea, handing it to him. "Here, drink this. It'll help." Derek took the cup, wrapping his hands around it and letting the warmth seep into his skin. He took a small sip, the hot liquid burning his throat in the best way. He closed his eyes, savoring the warmth, trying to ignore the pounding in his head. "I still can't believe you gave away your jacket," his mother said, her voice soft. She sat down on the edge of his bed, her eyes searching his face. "What were you thinking?" Derek shrugged, his eyes still closed. "He needed it more than I did," he said simply. "I couldn't just walk away." His mother sighed, shaking her head. "You've got a good heart, Derek, but you've got to take care of yourself too. It's winter. You need a jacket." "I know, Mom," Derek said, opening his eyes and looking at her. He gave her a small smile, trying to reassure her. "I'll be fine." She nodded, though her eyes were still filled with worry. She reached over, brushing a hand through his hair. "I just don't want you getting sick. We can't afford a doctor, you know that." "I know," Derek said, his voice soft. He took another sip of tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. He knew how hard things were, how much his mother worried about every little thing. He didn't want to add to her stress, but he couldn't ignore someone who needed help. It wasn't who he was. After finishing his tea, Derek forced himself out of bed, pulling on the worn-out hoodie his mother handed him. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He bundled up as best as he could, wrapping a scarf around his neck and pulling on a pair of gloves that were a little too big. "Be careful out there," his mother said as he headed for the door. "And come straight home after school, okay?" "I will," Derek promised, giving her a quick hug before stepping outside. The cold hit him immediately, and he shivered, hugging himself as he started down the street. The wind bit at his exposed skin, cutting through the thin fabric of his hoodie. He kept his head down, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, as he trudged along, trying to ignore the chill. The walk to school felt longer than usual, each step a struggle against the biting wind. Derek's head pounded, and his throat ached, but he kept moving, determined to make it through the day. He couldn't afford to miss school, not when he was already falling behind in math. When he finally reached the school, Derek was exhausted. He made his way to his locker, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the combination. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, could hear the whispers as they noticed his lack of a proper coat. He tried to ignore them, focusing on getting his books and making it to class on time. "Derek," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see Lisa, a girl from his history class, standing there, her brow furrowed in concern. "Where's your jacket?" Derek forced a smile, shrugging. "I gave it to someone who needed it more," he said, trying to sound casual. Lisa's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "Are you serious? It's freezing out there, Derek. You're going to get sick." "I'll be fine," Derek said, though his voice was hoarse, and he could feel the chill deep in his bones. Lisa sighed, reaching into her bag and pulling out a pair of gloves. "Here, take these. They're my brother's, but he never uses them. You need them more than he does." Derek hesitated, then took the gloves, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Lisa. I appreciate it." She smiled, her eyes softening. "Just try to stay warm, okay? You're too nice for your own good sometimes." Derek nodded, slipping the gloves on. They were warm, and he could already feel the difference. "I will. Thanks again." Lisa gave him a small wave before heading to her own class, and Derek watched her go, a smile tugging at his lips. Maybe the world wasn't all bad. Maybe there were still good people out there, people who cared. And maybe, just maybe, his small act of kindness would come back to him in ways he couldn't yet understand. Derek's mother almost collapsed when she saw him at the door without his jacket. "Derek, where is your jacket?" she gasped, her voice filled with both fear and anger. She pulled him inside, her hands instantly rubbing his frozen arms. I gave it to someone, Mom," he stammered, trying to keep his teeth from chattering. "He needed it more than me." Her eyes filled with tears, and Derek didn't know if it was from worry or pride. She wrapped a blanket around him, hugging him tightly. "You've got such a good heart, Derek. But I'm scared for you. We can't afford for you to get sick." Derek nodded, his throat tightening as he realized just how much his decision might cost them. He hugged the blanket closer, sitting down as the warmth slowly started to return to his frozen limbs. His mother kept rubbing his back, her eyes filled with concern, and Derek could feel the weight of his choice bearing down on him. He had helped someone, but now the consequences were becoming all too real. The next morning, Derek woke up with a sore throat. He tried to ignore the cold that seemed to settle deep in his bones. His mother made him tea, her face lined with worry as she urged him to stay home. But Derek refused. He couldn't afford to miss school, and he had to keep up. He bundled himself up in an old, worn-out hoodie his mom found, and started his walk to school. The wind cut through the thin fabric of the hoodie, and Derek shivered, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He passed the same corner where he had met the old man, and found it empty. The old man was gone. Derek paused, staring at the spot for a moment, hoping the man had found somewhere warm to go. He took a deep breath, then continued on his way, his head down against the biting wind. When he got to school, Derek was exhausted, his head pounded, and his throat felt raw. He made his way to his locker, trying to ignore the looks from his classmates. He could hear the whispers, the questions about where his jacket was, why he was wearing such a thin hoodie in the middle of winter. He kept his head down, focusing on getting through the day. "Derek," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see Mike, one of the guys from his neighborhood, standing there with a concerned expression. "What happened to your jacket, man?" Derek forced a smile, shrugging. "I gave it to someone who needed it more," he said, trying to sound casual. Mike's eyes widened, and he shook his head. "You serious? It's freezing out there. You're gonna get sick, dude." "I'll be fine," Derek said, though his voice was hoarse, and he could feel the chill deep in his bones. Mike frowned, then reached into his bag, pulling out a scarf. "Here, take this. It's not much, but it'll help." Derek hesitated, then took the scarf, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it." "No problem, man. Just try to stay warm, okay?" Mike said, giving him a pat on the shoulder before heading to his own class. Derek wrapped the scarf around his neck, the fabric soft against his skin. It wasn't much, but it helped. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as he headed to his first class. The day seemed to drag on, each hour feeling longer than the last. Derek's head throbbed and his body ached, but he pushed through, determined to make it to the end of the day. By lunchtime, Derek was exhausted. He sat down at a table in the cafeteria, pulling out the small sandwich his mom had packed for him. His hands were trembling from the cold, and he could barely hold the sandwich steady. "Hey, Derek," a voice said, and he looked up to see Lisa standing there, her eyes filled with concern. "Mind if I sit?" "Sure," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa sat down, her eyes scanning his face. "You look terrible. Are you okay?" Derek forced a smile, nodding. "I'm fine. Just a little cold. That's all." Lisa frowned, her eyes narrowing. You gave away your jacket, didn't you? Derek hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, he needed it more than I did. Lisa shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. You're too nice for your own good, you know that. She reached into her bag, pulling out a pair of gloves. Here, take these. They're my brother's, but he never uses them. You need them more. Derek took the gloves, his heart swelling with gratitude. Thanks, Lisa. I really appreciate it. She smiled, her eyes softening. Just try to stay warm, okay? We don't want you getting sick. Derek nodded, slipping the gloves on. They were a little big, but they were warm, and he could already feel the difference. I will. Thanks again. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Derek was exhausted, his body aching from the cold, but he pushed through, determined to make it to the end of the day. When the final bell rang, he grabbed his backpack and headed out, the cold air hitting him like a slap as soon as he stepped outside. He wrapped the scarf tighter around his neck, pulling the hood of his hoodie up as he started the long walk home. His feet felt like blocks of ice, and his fingers were numb even with the gloves. He kept his head down, his breath coming out in misty puffs as he trudged along, trying to ignore the cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. As he approached the corner where he had given his jacket away, Derek couldn't help but glance over, hoping to see the old man again. But the spot was empty, the brick wall bare and the sidewalk deserted. Derek sighed, his heart sinking. He hoped the man had found somewhere warm to go, somewhere safe. When Derek finally reached his apartment building, he was shivering uncontrollably. He fumbled with the door handle, his fingers stiff and uncooperative. He managed to get the door open, stumbling inside and collapsing against the wall, his body trembling from the cold. Derek, his mother called, her voice filled with worry. She appeared in the hallway, her eyes widening when she saw him. "Oh my God, Derek!" She rushed over, pulling him to his feet and guiding him into the apartment. She wrapped a blanket around him, her hands rubbing his arms, trying to bring warmth back to his frozen limbs. "You're going to catch your death out there," she muttered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm fine," Derek said, though his teeth were chattering so hard he could barely speak. He hugged the blanket closer, sinking onto the couch as his mother continued to fuss over him. She disappeared into the kitchen, returning a moment later with a cup of hot tea. "Here, drink this," she said, her voice softening. "You need to warm up." Derek took the cup, his hands trembling as he brought it to his lips. The warmth spread through him, easing the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he felt the warmth start to return. His mother sat down beside him, her eyes filled with worry. "You can't keep doing this, Derek. I know you want to help people, but you've got to take care of yourself, too." Derek nodded, his throat tightening. "I know, Mom. I couldn't just walk away. He needed help." She sighed, her eyes softening. "I know, baby, and I'm proud of you for that. But I don't want to lose you. You're all I have." Derek swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. He set the cup down, reaching over to hug his mother tightly. "I'm not going anywhere, Mom. I promise." She hugged him back, her arms wrapping around him tightly. "Just promise me you'll be more careful, okay?" "I promise," Derek whispered, his voice thick with emotion. They sat there for a long time, the warmth of the blanket and the tea slowly easing the chill that had settled in Derek's bones. He knew he'd made the right choice, but he also knew he had to be more careful. He couldn't afford to get sick, not for his sake, but for his mother's. As the evening wore on, Derek found himself thinking about the old man. He hoped, wherever he was, that he was warm and safe. He hoped that his small act of kindness had made a difference, even if it had cost him more than he'd expected. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. By the time Derek got home after school, he felt worse, his head pounding and his throat raw. He was exhausted, the cold sapping all of his strength. He reached the building, ready to collapse on his bed, but as he approached, something stopped him in his tracks. A sleek, black limousine was parked in front of his apartment building. Derek frowned, unsure of what to make of it. He took a step closer, watching as the door opened and a well-dressed man stepped out, his eyes locking onto Derek. "You must be Derek," the man said, his voice kind. "I'm here on behalf of someone you helped recently." Derek blinked, his heart racing as he thought back to the night before. The old man. The man nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "He wanted me to thank you personally for what you did. He also asked me to give you something." The man reached inside the limo, pulling out a box wrapped in blue paper. Derek stared at it, barely able to comprehend what was happening. The man handed him the box, his eyes kind. "Go ahead, open it," the man urged gently. Derek slowly tore the wrapping away, his hands trembling from both the cold and the emotions that were building inside him. When he opened the box, his eyes widened in shock. Inside was a brand new winter jacket, thick, warm, and more luxurious than anything Derek could have ever afforded. His throat tightened, and he looked up at the man, his eyes misting over. This is for me," Derek whispered, his voice cracking. The man nodded. "The gentleman you helped was deeply touched by your kindness. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of, just like you took care of him." Derek swallowed hard, unable to find the words. He ran his fingers over the soft fabric of the jacket, feeling the warmth that it promised. It was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of the impact his small act of kindness had made. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, and he quickly wiped them away, not wanting to cry in front of a stranger. "Thank you," Derek finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say." The man's smile grew warmer, and he placed a hand on Derek's shoulder. "You don't need to say anything, Derek. Just know that your kindness didn't go unnoticed. The world needs more people like you." Derek nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He looked down at the jacket again, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had never expected anything in return for his actions. He had just wanted to help someone in need. But this was more than he could have ever imagined. "There's one more thing," the man said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out an envelope. He handed it to Derek, who took it with trembling hands. "What is this?" Derek asked, his voice shaky. "Just a little something to help you and your mother," the man said. "The gentleman you helped wanted to make sure you both were taken care of." Derek opened the envelope, his eyes widening as he saw the stack of bills inside. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. There had to be several $100s in there, more money than he had ever held in his life. His heart pounded in his chest, and he looked up at the man, his eyes wide with shock. "I can't accept this," Derek said, his voice trembling. "It's too much." The man shook his head, his expression gentle. "It's not too much, Derek. It's just enough to help you get through the winter." The gentleman insisted, "and he wants you to know that you deserve it." Derek felt his eyes sting with tears again, and he looked down at the envelope, his hands shaking. He had never imagined that his simple act of kindness would lead to something like this. He had given away his only jacket because he couldn't stand to see someone else suffer, and now here he was, holding a brand new jacket and an envelope full of money that would make all the difference for him and his mom. "Thank you," Derek whispered again, his voice thick with emotion. "Please thank him for me. I don't even know how to express how grateful I am." The man nodded, his smile kind. "I will, Derek. And remember, the world needs more people like you. Keep being kind. You never know whose life you might change." Derek nodded, unable to speak. He watched as the man turned and got back into the limousine, the door closing with a soft click. The car pulled away from the curb, disappearing down the street, and Derek stood there for a moment, staring after it, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked down at the jacket in his hands, his fingers brushing over the soft fabric. It was the nicest thing he had ever owned, and he could feel the warmth radiating from it even before he put it on. Slowly, he slipped his arms into the sleeves, pulling the jacket around him. It fit perfectly, and as he zipped it up, he felt the warmth envelop him, seeping into his bones and chasing away the chill that had settled there. Derek took a deep breath, his eyes closing for a moment as he let the warmth wash over him. He had never felt anything like it before, not just the physical warmth of the jacket, but the warmth of knowing that his actions had made a difference, that someone had seen his kindness and wanted to repay it. He opened his eyes, looking down at the envelope in his hand. He knew that the money would make a huge difference for him and his mom. They could pay the rent, buy groceries, maybe even have a little left over for something special. It was more than just money, it was hope. Hope that things could get better, that the world wasn't always as cold and harsh as it seemed. Derek turned and headed inside, his heart still pounding in his chest. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, his steps feeling lighter than they had in days. When he reached the door, he knocked softly, and a moment later, his mother opened it, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. "Derek, where did you get that jacket?" she asked, her voice filled with shock. Derek smiled, his eyes misting over as he held up the envelope. "It's a long story, Mom, but someone wanted to thank me for helping them, and they wanted to help us too." His mother's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, pulling him into a tight hug. "Oh, Derek," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you. You have such a good heart." Derek hugged her back, his own eyes stinging with tears. "I just did what I thought was right, Mom. I didn't expect anything in return. That's what makes it so special," she said, pulling back to look at him, her eyes shining with pride. "You did something good, and the world noticed. That's rare, Derek. And it's beautiful." Derek smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. He looked down at the envelope, then back at his mother. "We can pay the rent, Mom, and maybe even get a few extra things we need." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks as she hugged him again. "Thank you, Derek, for everything. You're the best son a mother could ask for." Derek hugged her tightly, his heart full. He knew that things were still tough, that they would still have challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. And that was enough. The man explained that the old gentleman Derek helped was no ordinary beggar. He was actually a millionaire, down on his luck and disillusioned. Derek's simple act of compassion had reminded him that there was still kindness in the world, and now he wants to give back. "Not just to you, Derek, but to the community," the man said. Derek could hardly believe what he was hearing. His mind was still reeling from the new jacket and the envelope full of money, and now this? It was almost too much to process. He looked over at his mom, who sat next to him in the limousine, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and pride. "He wants to give back," Derek repeated, his voice shaky. "How?" The man smiled. "You'll see. We're almost there." The limousine moved smoothly through the streets of the city, the familiar sights of Derek's neighborhood blurring past the window. Derek tried to calm his racing heart, wondering what could possibly be waiting for them. He had never expected anything like this when he had given his jacket to the old man. He had just wanted to help someone in need. After a short drive, the limousine turned onto a side street and pulled up in front of a large brick building. Derek recognized it immediately. It was the community center. He had passed it countless times on his way to school, but it had always seemed run down and empty, a forgotten place that no one cared about anymore. The limousine came to a stop, and the man opened the door, gesturing for Derek and his mom to step out. "Come on. I think you'll want to see this." Derek and his mother stepped out of the car, and Derek stared up at the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. The building looked different. There were people outside, working to clean up the entrance, and a new sign hung above the door, bright and welcoming. "What's going on?" Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled, leading them towards the entrance. "The gentleman you helped wanted to do something meaningful. He decided to donate enough money to keep this place open, to give it new life. And he wanted you to be the inspiration behind it all." Derek's eyes widened, and he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "He did this because of me." "Yes," the man said. "Your kindness reminded him of what really matters." He wanted to make sure that the community had a place where people could come together, where kids like you could have a safe space to grow, learn, and feel supported. Derek looked over at his mom, who had tears in her eyes. She reached out, squeezing his hand tightly. "Derek, this is incredible," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. They walked through the entrance of the community center, and Derek felt a sense of awe wash over him. The inside was bustling with activity. People were cleaning, painting, setting up furniture. It was as if the whole place was being reborn, given a second chance, just like the old man himself. A woman approached them, her smile warm and welcoming. "You must be Derek," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Mrs. Thompson, the director of the community center. We're so glad you're here." Derek shook her hand, still feeling overwhelmed. I can't believe this is happening," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes filled with kindness. "Believe it, Derek. Your act of kindness inspired something amazing. This community center is going to be a place where people can come together, where kids can find support and opportunities. And it's all because of you." Derek felt a lump form in his throat, and he blinked back tears. He had never imagined that something as simple as giving away his jacket could lead to this. He had just wanted to help someone, and now that small act of kindness had sparked something that would make a difference for so many people. Mrs. Thompson led them through the community center, showing them the different rooms that were being renovated. There was a large space that would be used for after-school programs, a room filled with books that would serve as a library, and a kitchen where meals would be prepared for those in need. Derek could hardly believe what he was seeing. It was like a dream come true. "We're going to have programs for kids, classes for adults, and community events," Mrs. Thompson explained as they walked. "This is going to be a place where everyone is welcome, where everyone can find support and a sense of belonging." Derek's mom wiped at her eyes, her smile wide. "This is amazing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe all of this is happening because of Derek." Mrs. Thompson nodded. "It just goes to show that even the smallest acts of kindness can have a ripple effect. You never know how far your actions will reach or how many lives you might touch." Derek felt his heart swell with emotion. He looked around at the community center, at the people working to bring it back to life, and he felt a sense of pride that he had never felt before. He had made a difference. He had done something that mattered, something that would help others, and that feeling was worth more than anything. As they continued the tour, Mrs. Thompson led them to a room at the back of the building. It was a large, open space with big windows that let in lots of natural light. "This is going to be our new youth center," she said, her smile wide. "A place where kids like you, Derek, can come after school to hang out, do homework, and just be themselves." Derek looked around the room, his eyes wide. He could already imagine kids filling the space, laughing, playing games, working on projects together. It was a place where they could feel safe, where they could belong. From that moment on, Derek found himself spending most of his time at the community center. He helped organize book drives, set up for after-school programs, and worked with kids who needed guidance. The community center became more than just a place to volunteer. It became a second home. The people there were more than just neighbors. They were like family. He wasn't just helping. He had found a place where he truly belonged. Derek loved the sense of purpose that filled him every time he walked through the doors of the community center. There was always something to be done, someone who needed help, and he was more than happy to be there. The kids who came for the after-school programs looked up to him. He helped them with their homework, played games with them, and listened when they needed someone to talk to. Derek realized that he was making a difference, and that knowledge filled him with a sense of pride he had never known before. One day, as Derek was setting up chairs in the main hall for an upcoming event, he heard someone call his name. He looked up and saw Lisa, a girl from his history class, standing at the entrance. Derek was surprised, but pleased to see her. He hadn't spoken to Lisa much outside of class, but she was always friendly, and he had always admired her from afar. "Hey, Derek," Lisa said, smiling as she walked over. "I heard about what you've been doing here, and I wanted to come by and see if I could help." Derek's heart skipped a beat. "Really? That's awesome," he said, trying to keep his excitement in check. "We could always use more help. There's a lot to do around here." Lisa smiled, her eyes bright. "I'm ready to help with whatever you need. Just tell me where to start." Derek showed Lisa around the community center, introducing her to Mrs. Thompson and some of the other volunteers. He explained the different programs they were running, and Lisa listened intently, nodding as he spoke. She seemed genuinely interested, and Derek felt a warmth spread through him. It felt good to have someone his own age there, someone who cared about the same things he did. They spent the afternoon working side by side, setting up for the upcoming event and organizing supplies. As they worked, they talked about school, their families, and their dreams for the future. Derek found himself opening up to Lisa in a way he hadn't with anyone else. She was easy to talk to, and she seemed to understand him in a way that made him feel seen. Over the next few weeks, Lisa started coming to the community center regularly. She and Derek worked together on different projects, and slowly, their friendship grew. They would stay late after the programs ended, talking and laughing as they cleaned up. Lisa had a way of making even the most mundane tasks feel fun, and Derek found himself looking forward to their time together more and more. One afternoon, after they had finished organizing a book drive, Lisa and Derek sat on the steps outside the community center, watching the sun set over the city. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and a gentle breeze blew through the air. Derek looked over at Lisa, his heart pounding in his chest. "You know, I'm really glad you came here," Derek said, his voice soft. "I don't think I could have done all of this without you." Lisa smiled, her eyes meeting his. "I'm glad I came too. This place is special, Derek, and you're a big part of that." Derek felt his cheeks flush, and he looked down, trying to hide his smile. "I just want to help. I never thought it would turn into all of this." Lisa reached over, placing her hand on his. "That's what makes it so special. You didn't do it for recognition or praise. You did it because you care. And that's why everyone here looks up to you." Derek swallowed, his throat tightening. He looked up at Lisa, their eyes meeting again. There was something in her gaze that made his heart skip a beat. Something warm and genuine. Something that made him feel like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Thank you, Lisa," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for being here. For everything." Lisa smiled, her hand still resting on his. "You don't have to thank me, Derek. I'm just happy to be a part of this." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Derek realized that he had found more than just a place where he belonged. He had found someone who believed in him, someone who made him want to be better. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The weeks turned into months, and Derek continued to pour his heart into the community center. He helped organize more events, started a tutoring program for the younger kids, and even began leading workshops on leadership and community service. The community center had become a hub of activity, a place where people could come together and support one another, and Derek was at the heart of it all. Lisa was always by his side, her presence a constant source of support and encouragement. Together, they made a great team, and the community center flourished because of their efforts. Mrs. Thompson often commented on how much of a difference they were making, and Derek couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. One day, after a particularly successful event, Mrs. Thompson pulled Derek aside, her eyes filled with warmth. "Derek, I want you to know how proud I am of you," she said. "You've become a leader here, and the kids look up to you. You've made this place better for everyone." Derek felt his throat tighten, and he blinked back tears. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I just want to help." Mrs. Thompson smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And you have. More than you know. You're an inspiration, Derek. And I can't wait to see all the amazing things you're going to do in the future." Derek nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He looked around the community center at the kids laughing and playing, at the volunteers working together, and he knew that this was where he was meant to be. He had found his place, and he wasn't going to let it go. As the sun set that evening, Derek and Lisa stood outside the community center, watching as the last of the kids were picked up by their parents. Lisa looked over at Derek, her eyes filled with warmth. "You know, Derek, I think this is just the beginning," she said, her voice soft. Derek looked over at her, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Lisa smiled, her eyes meeting his. "I think you're going to do amazing things. Not just here, but everywhere. You have a heart for this, and people see that. You're going to make a difference, Derek. I know it." Derek felt his cheeks flush, and he looked down, a smile tugging at his lips. "I hope so. I just want to keep helping however I can." Lisa reached over, taking his hand in hers. "And I'll be right here with you. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Derek looked up at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He squeezed her hand gently, his smile widening. "Yeah, together." In that moment, Derek knew that he had found more than just a community center, more than just a place to belong. He had found a purpose, a family, and someone who believed in him. And as he stood there, watching the sun set over the city, he knew that this was only the beginning of something truly special. Mrs. Thompson turned to Derek, her eyes filled with warmth. "We would love for you to be a part of this, Derek. You're the reason this is happening, and we want you to be involved in making this community center the best it can be." Derek's heart skipped a beat, and he felt a smile spread across his face. "I'd love to help," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "I want to do whatever I can." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her smile growing. "That's wonderful to hear. We're going to need all the help we can get, and I know you'll be a great role model for the other kids." Derek's mom placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Derek," she said, her voice trembling. "You're making a real difference." Derek looked up at his mom, his heart swelling with emotion. "I just wanted to help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought it would lead to all of this." Mrs. Thompson smiled. "That's the power of kindness, Derek. One small act can change the world, one person at a time." As they left the community center that day, Derek felt a sense of hope and excitement that he hadn't felt in a long time. The world didn't seem quite as cold and harsh anymore. It seemed full of possibilities, full of people who cared, who wanted to make a difference. The community center was just the beginning. Derek knew that there was still so much work to be done, but he was ready for it. He was ready to be a part of something bigger than himself, to help others and make his community a better place. And as he walked back to the limousine with his mom by his side, Derek couldn't help but smile. He had given away his only jacket because he couldn't stand to see someone else suffer. And now, that simple act of compassion had sparked something incredible, something that would change not only his life, but the lives of so many others. It was more than he could have ever hoped for, and it was just the beginning. Weeks later, Derek was at the community center, organizing supplies for the after-school program, when he heard someone calling his name. He turned, and to his surprise, he saw the old man standing in the doorway. But this time, the old gentleman looked completely different. He was healthy, his face full of color, and he wore a well-tailored suit that made him look distinguished and confident. Derek could hardly believe it was the same man. The old man smiled warmly as he walked towards Derek, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Derek, my boy," he said, his voice carrying warmth and sincerity. "It's good to see you again." Derek quickly set down the stack of books he had been holding and walked over, a grin spreading across his face. "Mr. Wells, you look amazing," Derek said, shaking the old man's hand, his heart swelling with joy at seeing the man so well. Mr. Wells, the man Derek had once helped in the cold, pulled Derek into a warm embrace. Derek was taken aback, but hugged him back, feeling a rush of emotion. It was hard to believe that this was the same man he had found huddled against the cold brick wall just weeks before. "You know, Derek," Mr. Wells said as he stepped back, his eyes misty, "your kindness changed my life. I was at my lowest, and you gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I'll never forget what you did for me." Derek's eyes stung with tears, and he blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Wells. I just did what anyone would have done." Mr. Wells shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "No, Derek. Not just anyone would have done what you did. You gave me your only jacket when you had so little yourself. That's not something most people would do." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small box, wrapped in dark velvet. He held it out to Derek, his eyes filled with emotion. "I have something for you, Derek. It's a small token of my appreciation." Derek hesitated for a moment before taking the box, his hands trembling slightly. He looked up at Mr. Wells, his brow furrowed. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Wells smiled. "Please open it. It's something very special to me, and I want you to have it." Derek carefully lifted the lid of the box, his breath catching in his throat when he saw what was inside. It was a watch, an elegant vintage timepiece with a leather band that looked worn with age. The watch face was classic, with delicate, intricate hands, and the metal gleamed in the light. Derek could tell it was old, but it was beautiful. "This watch," Mr. Wells said, his voice softening, "has been in my family for generations. It belonged to my father and his father before him. It's always been a symbol in our family, a reminder that time is the most precious gift we have. And now I want you to have it." Derek's eyes widened, and he looked up at Mr. Wells, his heart pounding. I can't take this," he stammered, shaking his head. "This is too important. It means too much." Mr. Wells placed a gentle hand on Derek's shoulder, his eyes kind. "It's because it means so much that I want you to have it. You reminded me that even in the darkest times, there's still good in the world. You gave me hope, Derek. And I want you to carry this watch as a reminder that your kindness matters, that the time we give to others is the greatest gift of all." Derek felt his throat tighten, and he swallowed hard, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. He looked down at the watch, his fingers brushing gently over the smooth leather band. It was beautiful, and the weight of its significance settled deep in his chest. "Thank you," Derek whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know what to say." Mr. Wells smiled, his eyes glistening. "You don't have to say anything, my boy. Just keep being the kind, generous person you are. That's all the thanks I need." Derek nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He carefully fastened the watch around his wrist, the leather band fitting snugly. It felt right, like it belonged there, a reminder of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. Just then, Mrs. Thompson approached, her eyes widening when she saw Mr. Wells. "Oh my goodness, Mr. Wells. It's wonderful to see you again," she said, her smile bright. Mr. Wells turned to her, his smile widening. "Mrs. Thompson, it's good to see you too. I wanted to come by and see how everything was going. It looks like the community center is thriving." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "Thanks to your generous donation, We've been able to do so much. The programs are running smoothly, and we've had more kids coming in every day. It's been wonderful." Mr. Wells glanced over at Derek, his smile softening. "I'm glad to hear it. None of this would have been possible without Derek. He's the true hero here." Derek's cheeks flushed, and he looked down, feeling a mix of embarrassment and pride. "I just wanted to help," he said, his voice quiet. Mrs. Thompson placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with warmth. "And you have, Derek. More than you know." Mr. Wells stayed for a while longer, touring the community center and talking with the kids and volunteers. Derek watched as the man laughed and shared stories, his presence bringing a sense of warmth and hope to everyone around him. It was hard to believe that this was the same man Derek had found shivering in the cold, alone and hopeless. The transformation was incredible, and it filled Derek with a sense of purpose. After Mr. Wells left, Derek stayed behind to help clean up. He couldn't stop glancing down at the watch on his wrist, the weight of it both literal and symbolic. It was a reminder that time was precious, that every moment mattered, and that the kindness we show to others can change lives in ways we might never fully understand. As Derek swept the floors and stacked the chairs, Lisa walked over, her eyes catching the glint of the watch on his wrist. "Hey, that's a nice watch," she said, her voice filled with curiosity. "Where did you get it?" Derek looked up, a smile tugging at his lips. "Mr. Wells gave it to me. It's a family heirloom. He said it's a reminder that time is the most precious gift we have." Lisa's eyes softened, and she reached out, gently touching his arm. "That's beautiful, Derek. And he's right. You've given so much of your time to this place, to all of us. You deserve it." Derek felt his heart swell, and he looked down at the watch, his smile widening. "I just want to make a difference. I want to keep helping however I can." Lisa nodded, her eyes filled with warmth. "And you are. You're making a difference every single day. And I'm so proud of you." Derek looked up at her, their eyes meeting, and he felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the watch or the community center. It was the warmth of knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. "Thank you, Lisa," he said, his voice soft, "for being here, for everything." Lisa smiled, her eyes shining. "Always, Derek. I'll always be here." As they finished cleaning up and walked out of the community center together, Derek looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to twinkle above. He thought about everything that had happened, about the old man and the watch, about the community center and the people he had met along the way. He thought about the time he had given, the kindness he had shown, and the difference it had made. And he knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. There was still so much to do, so many lives to touch, and he was ready for it. He had found his place, his purpose, and he wasn't going to let it go. The watch on his wrist ticked softly, a reminder that time was precious, that every moment mattered. And as Derek walked beside Lisa, their hands brushing together, he knew that he was going to make every second count. Derek never imagined that one act of kindness could change so much. When he gave away his only jacket to a man in need, he wasn't thinking about what might come of it. He just wanted to help. But that small, selfless gesture had created ripples that spread far beyond what Derek could have ever anticipated. The community center thrived, and Derek's story began to spread, inspiring others to give back in ways they hadn't before. It started with just a few people. A local business owner heard about Derek's story and decided to donate supplies to the community center. Books, sports equipment, art materials, things that the kids desperately needed but couldn't afford. The donations made a huge difference, and soon, the community center was overflowing with opportunities for the children who came there after school. The news spread further, reaching people Derek had never even met. A group of college students from a neighboring town came to volunteer, bringing fresh energy and new ideas for workshops and programs. They helped create a tutoring program, set up computer classes, and even organized a sports league for the kids. The community center was buzzing with activity, and Derek could see the difference it was making in the lives of the people who came there. It wasn't just a building anymore. It had become a beacon of hope. Derek found himself busier than ever, but he loved every minute of it. He spent his days helping organize events, tutoring the younger kids, and making sure everything ran smoothly. He had found his place, his purpose, and it filled him with a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. And through it all, Lisa was always by his side, her laughter and warmth a constant source of comfort and joy. One Saturday morning, Derek arrived at the community center early, as he often did. He was greeted by the sight of children running around the front yard, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. A few of the college volunteers were already setting up tables for the day's activities. As Derek walked inside, he was met with the familiar sight of Mrs. Thompson, who smiled warmly at him. "Morning, Derek," she said, her eyes twinkling. "We've got a busy day ahead of us. The tutoring program has more kids signed up than ever, and I think we're going to need more tables for the arts and crafts activity." Derek nodded, already rolling up his sleeves. "I'll get right on it, Mrs. Thompson." As he moved through the community center, helping where he could, Derek couldn't help but notice how alive the place felt. It was filled with people, children, volunteers, parents, all working together, all a part of something bigger. It made Derek smile. He knew that this sense of community, this coming together of people from all walks of life, was what mattered most. They had created something special, something that made a difference in people's lives. Later that afternoon, while Derek was helping a group of kids with their math homework, Lisa walked over, a smile on her face. "Hey, Derek, I think you need to come outside. There's someone here who wants to see you." Derek looked up, curiosity piqued. "Who is it?" Lisa just smiled, a glint of excitement in her eyes. "Come on, you'll see." Derek followed Lisa out to the front of the community center, where a small group of people had gathered. Standing at the center of the group was Mr. Wells, the old man Derek had helped all those weeks ago. He looked different once again, standing tall and confident, his eyes bright and full of purpose. Derek's heart swelled with emotion as he approached. "Mr. Wells," Derek said, his voice filled with surprise, "it's great to see you again." Mr. Wells smiled, his eyes softening. "Derek, my boy, it's wonderful to see you too." He paused for a moment, then gestured to the people around him. "I wanted you to meet some friends of mine. When I told them about what you did for me, they wanted to be a part of this too. They wanted to help." Derek looked around at the group. There were men and women of all ages, all smiling at him warmly. Mr. Wells continued, "These are people who have the means to make a difference, Derek. Business owners, community leaders. They've come here today because they want to support the community center to help it grow even more." Derek was speechless. He looked at Mr. Wells, his heart pounding in his chest. "You did this? All of this because of what happened that night?" Mr. Wells nodded, his smile widening. "You inspired me, Derek. Your kindness reminded me that there's still good in this world, and that we all have a responsibility to help one another. I've been fortunate in my life, and I want to use that fortune to make a difference. And it all started with you." Tears stung at Derek's eyes, and he quickly blinked them away. He looked around at the people who had gathered, at the community center that was thriving, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had never imagined that something as simple as giving away his jacket could lead to all of this. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. The new supporters toured the community center, speaking with Mrs. Thompson and the other volunteers about how they could help. Derek watched as people came together, united by a common purpose, and it filled him with a sense of pride. He knew that this was only the beginning, that there was still so much they could do, so many lives they could touch. That evening, as the sun began to set, Derek and Lisa stood outside the community center, watching as the last of the volunteers packed up for the day. Lisa looked over at Derek, her eyes filled with warmth. "You know, you've really started something amazing here," she said, her voice soft. Derek looked down at the watch on his wrist, the one Mr. Wells had given him. He ran his fingers over the smooth leather band, a smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't do it alone. None of this would have happened without everyone else. Without you." Lisa reached over, taking his hand in hers. "But it started with you, Derek. It started with your kindness. And look at what it's become." Derek looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He thought back to that cold night, to the moment he had decided to take off his jacket and give it to a man who needed it more. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, but now, standing here, surrounded by the community that had grown because of that one act, Derek realized just how powerful kindness could be. "Kindness changes everything," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it just takes one person to start the change." Lisa smiled, squeezing his hand. "And you were that person, Derek. You made a difference, and you're going to keep making a difference. I know it." Derek looked out at the community center, at the children playing in the yard, at the volunteers laughing and talking as they worked. He felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of purpose that filled every part of him. He knew that this was where he was meant to be, that this was what he was meant to do. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Derek knew that this was only the beginning. The ripples of his actions had spread far and wide, touching lives in ways he could never have imagined. And he was ready for whatever came next, ready to keep giving, to keep helping, to keep making a difference. The watch on his wrist ticked softly, a reminder that time was precious, that every moment mattered. And Derek knew that as long as he had time, he would use it to make the world a better place, one act of kindness at a time.